webinar, How and How Not to Get Higher Reading Scores. I'm Carrie McMahon with McGraw-Hill Education, and I will be the webinar moderator for today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping items. This webinar is being presented in listen-only mode, which means you will be able to hear the presenter, but he will not be able to hear you. However, that doesn't mean you cannot participate. We, of course, want to hear any questions you have, so just type those in the questions panel on your toolbar, and we'll address those at a few points throughout the presentation. We want to actually start with a poll. You should see this pop up on your screen. Please let us know what state test you are using. I think the results come through pretty quickly, so we'll just give everyone a minute to jump in. Great. Oh, you guys are voting? Okay. So it looks like we have about, I would say, 15% of you using SBAC, 5% using PARC, 2% using ACT Aspire, 5% using AIR Assessment, and a whopping 73% of you using various other state tests, which will be interesting, and we would love to hear about that in the comments as well. Thank you for participating, and now I want to introduce Dr. Timothy Shanahan. Dr. Shanahan is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Urban Education at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he was founding director of the Center for Literacy and chair of the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. He is also visiting research professor at Queen's University, Belfast, Northern Ireland. He is principal investigator of the National Title I Study of Implementation and Outcomes, Early Childhood Language Development. Dr. Shanahan was director of reading for the Chicago Public Schools. His research emphasizes reading-writing relationships, reading assessment, and improving reading achievement. He is past president of the International Reading Association. In 2006, he received a presidential appointment to serve on the advisory board of the National Institute for Literacy. He was inducted to the Reading Hall of Fame in 2007. He is also a former first grade teacher. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Shanahan.
Thank you, Carrie. It's good to be here, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you, McGraw-Hill, for bringing us all together. I wish we were face-to-face, but with everybody's work schedules and so on, I know that's impossible. I know that there are probably at least some of you who are not real happy with the testing regimes that are taking place in schools and that states have imposed upon us. And I have my own concerns about that, but nevertheless, we're still interested in trying to raise achievement for our kids, and we'd like to see them do better on these tests, whether we like the tests or not. And so that's really what this presentation is about. And just as the title suggests, I'm going to focus on both some of the things that we've been doing that a lot of schools, I think I'd be very surprised if many of your schools aren't doing some of these things that actually don't work, but that have become quite popular and that aren't really leading to higher test scores. And I'm going to try to suggest some very practical ways that you could actually reach out to kids and to effectively raise reading achievement. Some of you know, I always post my presentations on my website, Shanahan on Literacy, and I will do that with this one in the next couple of days. So with that, let's jump into what I've got planned for you. And this is actually linked to the poll that you just heard the results of. I was kind of curious who I'd be talking to. I think that there are probably a number of states that are using SBAC and PARC, but as we can see that there are probably more of you from states that have chosen not to use those assessments, and that's just fine because the kinds of things I'm going to be talking about, frankly, cut across all of these, and including the states that have their own individual assessments. So I'm not leaving you out. You'll be the focus every bit as much as those states that multiple states are using the same one. Let's start with the negatives. Let's start with the things that we've been doing that actually don't work or don't really serve kids very well. And I'm going to highlight for this section of the talk two popular approaches. The one where we focus on bubble kids, and the one where we try to teach specific comprehension skills. And I want to just work through both of these, and then we'll turn to the positive. The problem with these two really popular approaches to getting higher test scores is they actually don't work. If your goal is to see kids reading better and scoring better as a result of that. I've got an example on this slide showing a real simplified example of this bubble kid strategy. I mean, here I've got a classroom or a school that only has 7 kids in it, so it makes the numbers real easy. But essentially, you can see these students are scoring as low as 37, like children F and G, and they're scoring as high as 50, like student A. And on this imaginary test, the cut score is 46. And all that means is that in this fictional state, to meet or exceed the state standard, one would have to get a 46 or higher on the test. And so as you can see, only 3 of the kids, 3 of the 7, so a little less than half of the kids are actually meeting the standard. And so this is a school that would get pretty low marks, and when these appeared in the newspaper, you can imagine that the community wouldn't be real happy with these scores and so on and so forth. Well, I've seen many principals and teachers take the bubble kid approach, and what I'm talking about there is identifying those kids who are really close to meeting the standard. And since in this example, 46 is what we're trying to achieve, here's a youngster who has gotten a 45, our student D. He's only missing by a point. If we could put a lot of resources into student D, we'll ignore the rest of these kids, but if we can just get student D to do a little bit better, we're going to look better. And in fact, there's schools that do that. And I've had principals explain this whole process to me and how important it is. If we targeted student D in this way, and let's say we get his score up by a single point, he goes up all the way to a 46, we will have increased our percentage of kids meeting and exceeding standards by 33% for this fictional school. A dramatic change, something that we'll tout in the local papers, what a great job we've done this year. Well, if you actually look at the average, what we were doing before this big effort, we were getting 43.9 on this reading test on average across the 7 kids, but now our performance is all the way up to 44. In other words, it's only gone up 1/10 of a point. These kids aren't actually reading any better, but we've sure made the school look better. We've sure made ourselves look better. And I guess student D is happy. If I were a parent of student E, F, or G, I might not be so thrilled. This clearly is an unethical practice and a really inappropriate way to try to raise student test scores. A more popular way, a more widely used way, and one that's even recommended by some professional organizations, is the one where the term that we often use is use your data. And what I mean by that is there are folks that will do workshops for you showing you how to go through your students' reading comprehension test performance, the performance on all those tests that were in my survey earlier, and essentially go through and figure out what kinds of questions the boys and girls were struggling with, and then teach the heck out of those specific skills, the ones that the kids actually have trouble with the idea that if our kids have trouble with main idea questions, if we teach a lot of main ideas, then they're going to do better on the main idea questions, and we'll get higher test scores that way. Now, this one isn't obviously unethical like the first one. You're not just pretending to raise achievement while making some kids insignificantly look better. What you're doing here is something that logically makes a lot of sense. Identify the deficiencies and teach to them so that they aren't deficiencies anymore. There's a problem with it, however, and the problem is that isn't how reading comprehension tests work. None of the tests that were listed in the survey work that way. None of the commercial standardized reading comprehension tests that are on the market or that have been on the market work that way. And I promise you that if your state is developing a new reading comprehension test to use in the future, and I know some of them are, those aren't going to work any differently. This is a basic of how tests are designed. It's a basic of how reading comprehension works. I have some data to show you here from one of the more recent studies of this. This is just an example, by the way. This particular example focuses on the ACT test, but what I'm telling you about here is a basic property of reading comprehension tests generally. And so this is an example, but if we had your state scores up here, you'd see exactly the same kind of thing. Now, this particular slide comes from the American College Testing folks. The data that are being summarized on it come from a couple of 100,000 high school juniors. And what it is, it's if you look at the bottom, the x-axis, that row along the bottom, 11, 12, 13, all the way up to 36, what that is are the student scores on the ACT. And so a student who gets, for example, a 21 would, their data on that red and black line that's moving diagonally across there, they'd be summarized right over that 21. And so we know that, what these kids are doing in reading comprehension from the lowest scores on the ACT all the way up to the perfect score on the ACT. If you look on the y-axis, that is the column at the left that starts at the bottom, 0, 10, 20, all the way up to 100. That's the average percentage of comprehension questions that the students answer correctly. So what you can see, something that I'm sure you all knew before, is that the kids who do the best on the ACT test, the test that a lot of kids take to get into college, the kids who do best on that obviously answer more reading comprehension questions right, and the kids who score really low and probably don't get into college answer a lot fewer comprehension questions right. That's why that line is diagonal. It goes from low. The kids who get 11 only answer about 20% or so of the questions, and the kids who get 36s answer about 100% of the questions. The two diagonal lines, and it is two lines, one of them summarizes how the students did on all the literal questions. Those are the questions that just ask you to find the answer stated explicitly in the text. And the red line summarizes the inferential performance, which is all the interpretive questions, all the ones where you actually have to do some of that higher order reasoning or higher order thinking to make sense of. And what you notice is those lines are awfully close together. In fact, they're so close together, what statisticians would tell you is that the little separations that you're seeing is just statistical noise. The two lines are actually absolutely identical at every point of performance. So those kids who get 11, literal and inferential comprehension, comes out exactly the same. One isn't any harder for these students than another. The kids who get 15, the same. The kids who get 21, the same. The kids who get 28, it's exactly the same. There is no variation in that. Now that puzzled the ACT folks. I think they should have known this given past research on this question, but it did puzzle them, and they wanted to try to get the lines to separate so that they could figure out something that they could do diagnostically to identify the kinds of skills that students needed to do this way of raising test scores, just like I've described to you. So they analyzed their data a different way. This time they broke out all the questions, main idea questions, supporting detail questions, relationships among characters or relationships among ideas questions, vocabulary questions, drawing conclusions questions. One line. There's absolutely no difference in performance at any point along the line. It doesn't matter if you're a good reader, an average reader, a superstar reader. There is no difference in how you perform on any of these question types. And when you do find differences, when you, oh, my class, the kids did better on one type or another, it's just statistical noise. It isn't anything real. Now, this is about as far as most studies of this have usually gone. They show either that reading comprehension tests measure a single thing. They don't measure main ideas and supporting details and relationships and so on. They measure, frankly, reading comprehension, a big global construct, a construct that you can't break into its subparts because the subparts aren't separate. They don't come out any differently. And or another way to look at it is, well, the test measures a single factor, or another way of saying it is question types. If we know how the kids do on the different questions, it wouldn't explain any of the variance in their reading comprehension, and so it wouldn't make any difference. Now, ACT, I'm criticizing them for not knowing that this was how these data were going to come out, but I'm complimenting them for both for making these data available, but just as importantly, they stuck with this question. Remember, they're trying to figure out what can we do with reading comprehension? What can we do with our tests that would tell students something? And so they tried analyzing it a different way. And this time what they did is, instead of looking at the question type, they looked at the passages themselves. They simply divided their test passages, the articles that the students are asked to read, into three sets. Uncomplicated passages, those that are fairly simple to understand, more challenging text that might have, more sophisticated vocabulary or more complicated syntax or organization, those kinds of factors, and complex text, texts that are even harder and more challenging. And what you see from this chart is that, in fact, now you can get the lines to jump apart. Kids do perform differently on the different levels of passages, but they don't perform differently on the different kinds of questions. And so this effort to use tests to identify particular skills that students have or don't have so that you can focus your teaching in the right places is really just a fool's errand. You can't possibly get there. These tests just can't provide that kind of information. The question types don't work that way. And so ACT, as I say, is just an example of this. People have been studying this off and on since the early 1940s, and always with the same result. Reading comprehension scores can't be broken down into subparts. You get an overall score, and that's about as well as you can do. You're going to find out that some kids are reading better than others, which is good, and these tests are darn good at putting kids in that list and showing you who's the better reader and so on. But they're not good at telling you what to teach that would allow you to raise the test scores. Reading comprehension tests don't assess individual skills or standards. Reading comprehension isn't mainly a skilled activity linked to those question types. Reading comprehension tests are not diagnostic tests. They don't reveal skill differences. And analyzing item performance is really a waste of time. If you want to raise reading comprehension performance, you have to teach students to read. And that's really going to be my overall recommendation. If you want higher reading scores, you're going to have to teach reading, not teach kids how to do well on tests per se. We're going to, at this stage, turn our attention to those things that work and the kinds of things that I think you should be doing and that you should know about that would help you to have kids do better on these tests and frankly, to read better. We're going to raise reading achievement the old-fashioned way by actually improving the student's ability to read rather than just trying to make the test scores look better. As we go along, Carrie mentioned it at the beginning, but please, if you have questions along the way, if you're curious, why things work the way they do, or we're going to have some questions about some of what I'm saying, please type those in, and we're going to stop a couple of times, in fact, quite soon, to take some of those questions. So let's think about reading. And I think one of the things I want to focus on here is what students can do when they're in a testing situation. I know that teachers are usually very, very good at scaffolding children's reading in the classroom, guiding them, supporting them, so that a student is able to make sense of a text that maybe they couldn't make sense of on their own. Unfortunately, in a testing situation, you don't get to do that. You don't get to pre-teach vocabulary. You don't get to read the text to the students. You don't get to do a picture walk. You don't get to do any of the myriad of things that teachers do that they find sort of help kids keep their head in the game. And so it's not enough that we teach kids to read. We've also got to give them some tools, it seems to me, that would allow them to operate more effectively when they have to work independently as they do on a reading comprehension test. And the reading comprehension test that you give really asks, how could these boys and girls do without any teacher help, without any teacher assistance, without any instruction there? And I think a lot of our instruction, instead of making kids stronger, is probably, if anything, sort of steering them away from some of the kinds of skills or abilities that they need to actually be an independent reading system. So with that, let's turn to the first point I want to make. And as the title says, decoding and fluency matter a lot. To read a text, you have to read the words independently. Most elementary school students who struggle with reading tend to struggle to decode. In fact, I think NICHD studies, when they summarized across a lot of their research, they were finding that something like 84, 86% of the boys and girls who were struggling with reading during those elementary school years had decoding problems. They might have trouble with phonological awareness, they might have trouble with phonics, they might have trouble with fluency, but they were struggling in those areas. Now, that doesn't mean those are the only things they're struggling on. So if you just went in and taught phonics, or you just went in and tried to address that deficiency, it might not be sufficient, because one of the things NICHD also found was that while a lot of kids who struggled had these decoding problems, they also usually had other problems as well. So if you help them overcome the decoding, there might be something else that would block them. Basically, it's important that we make sure that kids know what are sounds and how spelling patterns match up with pronunciations. And students need to develop oral reading fluency. Now, this is an interesting one. I have an argument with a number of principals ongoing right now on my website, because a lot of principals have said to me, these students in 3rd and 4th and 5th grade who are taking these tests, they're not tested on oral reading. Why should we focus on fluency? I don't want my teachers spending the kids' time on fluency when that isn't what's going to be tested. They should be just doing oral reading and silent reading in the classroom, because silent reading is what they're going to be tested on. So there's a kind of logic to that. I get what the principals are saying. It makes great sense. And let's face it, for most kids, our lifetime goal for them is that they be good silent readers. I mean, we honestly, for most kids, we don't care how well they can do oral reading when they leave us. But the reason why I'm promoting oral reading practice and instruction in your schools as a way of raising reading achievement is because the National Reading Panel reviewed the research on such fluency instruction and found that having elementary kids practice oral reading and practice it by reading texts that are a bit of a challenge to them, reading those texts multiple times so that they get good at it. They don't just go chopping through a passage. They do it until they're good at it, or they do it multiple times with some kind of feedback so that they have help if they're trying to figure out a word or something. essentially that kind of practice raises reading performance. Well, not surprisingly, it improves oral reading performance. But what does surprise a lot of principals is that, in fact, that kind of oral reading practice also improves silent reading. It carries over. It has a very big impact. In fact, every single study that we looked at on this had silent reading comprehension as the outcome or as one of the outcomes. And in all but one cases, across a large number of studies, it was effective. And so this notion that we should only practice things that look like the test, phonics isn't going to be on the test, fluency isn't going to be on the test, oral reading isn't going to be on the test. That's all true, and yet those kinds of instruction and those kinds of practice are often what allow kids to do well on silent reading comprehension tests. That's pretty important. I think this is where I wanted to stop for a moment and see if we had any questions come in at this point that I could help with, and then we're going to turn our attention to word meanings and vocabulary and some of the things that need to be done there. Do we have any questions?
Okay. Well, we are looking for questions here. 1 second. Hi, Tim. I think this question came from earlier, but hoping it's still relevant. What does bullet 4 look like in the classroom? I think that was from about 5 minutes ago.
I'm going to have to go back and think about it.
Yeah. And I think it was from, yeah.
It could be from this, from the fluency one.
I think it is, because then her follow-up question was, if not round robin, how does the teacher monitor oral fluency?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, that is for that slide. Yeah. Good question. Whoever asked it. What the research shows us, and certainly what my own experience in classrooms shows me, is that just as the question suggests, round robin isn't so wonderful. It's too time-consuming. The kids don't get enough oral reading practice in it, and it's awfully hard to put in the repetition and so on that's needed. So there are a number of ways, all of which seem to be effective. Paired reading is effective. Echo reading has been found to be effective. Something called neurological impress, which is an approach usually used in special education to get kids to do oral reading practice, is effective. Radio reading, again, just a number of practices. The things that you want to look for is you want practices that have kids doing quite a bit of oral reading, so that they get to read more than just a few sentences, and that they get to reread to make better. So probably the workhorse, the one that I recommend most often in classrooms, is paired reading. The way that I set this up is having two kids, reading to each other, one maybe taking the first page and the other taking the next page, and so on through an article for some amount of time. Reading to each other, giving each other feedback, with the teacher not, this isn't the time to go do some other lesson, but the teacher supervising this and essentially moving among the pairs, listening to kids reading, giving feedback herself, coaching these children to be better coaches, and so on. And so it looks like essentially, if you had 30 kids in your classroom, you'd have 15 pairs of kids taking turns reading to each other, with a teacher moving around the various groups, doing everything from taking over, being the partner for a few moments, to maybe doing some of the reading to the kids to model it and show them what it should sound like, to recording some information about how well they were doing so she could follow up with particular kids. That's very effective. It's certainly not the other way, the only way to do this, but it's one of those practices that I use over and over again, and then you can maybe vary it out with some other kinds of things like repeated reading or reader's theater or things like that. But that's basically what we're talking about here.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. I believe that was Suzanne. That was a great question. Another question that we have, Dr. Shanahan, students with IEPs usually have a targeted skill or goal to work on. Many times they do not connect the phonics or word work that is being done to text that is not decodable. How would you advise teachers on this?
Yeah, that's the question's a good one, and it's something that folks have been noticing for a very long time. In fact, it's one of the reasons why I recommend once kids, we start doing fluency work as soon as students can begin reading, but fluency work becomes especially important when kids know their phonics skills and yet can't really apply them very well, aren't so good in a reading situation. And so back in the 1970s, researchers got really interested in how this sort of fluency practice that I was describing might make a difference. And it's believed that this practice that I'm talking about, one of the things it does is it gives kids a practice and sort of shows them, guides them in using or applying their phonics skills within a real reading situation so that they actually get better at it. I told everybody a moment ago that this oral reading practice improves reading comprehension, and that's certainly true, but it's also true, and I didn't mention it, it's also true that fluency practice tends, during the elementary years, tends to have a bigger impact on word recognition and phonics skills than it does on comprehension. So it has quite a powerful impact on both. The thing that interested me about that, surprised me about that, is I kind of had it in my head, you'd learn the words first, right, how to sound out words, and then you'd become fluent, and then once you were fluent, you'd comprehend. But this fluency practice was having an impact on both ends. It was both helping kids to understand what they were reading better, probably because they were figuring out the words better, but it was also definitely helping kids to figure out words, to actually apply the phonics skills in a real reading in a situation with text that is not always easily, simply decodable. And so, again, I'm going to really argue for, by the time kids are in these testing years, this 3rd, 4th, 5th grade and up, oral reading practice really should have a regular place in the reading instruction, despite the fact that it looks different than the testing. And with that, I think I'd better get back to the presentation because there's some ideas here I want to share before we run out of time, if that's okay. And we can come back to some more questions in just a little bit.
Okay.
So let's turn our attention to vocabulary. We've been talking about words, but we've been talking about word recognition. Let's talk about word meanings, which is obviously central to reading comprehension. And it increases in its importance as you move up through the grades. So vocabulary is a very big issue. I think it's obvious to anybody, you don't need me to tell you, that if you don't know the meaning to the words, you're going to have a heck of a time figuring out the meaning of the text itself. And that's absolutely true. However, vocabulary instruction is complicated. It's clearly beneficial to teach kids the meanings of specific words, and I certainly am a proponent of that. There are a number of research studies showing that if you teach kids the meanings of particular words and get those words into their memories, their reading comprehension will improve. But as studies of this have shown, it depends, if we're interested in reading comprehension, and how kids do on things like standardized tests, the payoff from vocabulary instruction varies quite a bit. Steve Stahl and his colleagues did a meta-analysis a while back looking at all the studies they could find on teaching vocabulary. And what they were finding was that if teachers were teaching kids the words from the text that they were going to be tested on or evaluated on or that they were expected to answer questions on, teaching kids those words ahead of time improved reading performance by, well, typically on something like an elementary standardized test by a year, by a grade level. So, you know, gee, if this was a group of third graders, instead of reading like third graders, they'd read more like fourth graders. However, if it was the more realistic situation where you didn't get to teach the words that were actually going to be on the test, but that you just teach words and we just sort of hoped that they matched up with the passages kids were reading, well, then the impacts were actually quite a bit less. They were only about a third as much, in fact, a little less than a third as much. And so instead of improving kids' performance, say, on an entire grade level, it only improved by, you know, 2-3 months, which is not nothing. That's important, that's valuable, and yet we'd certainly like to see a bigger payoff. So just teaching the words, as good as that is, as useful as that is, I want to get us beyond that a little bit and encourage a bit more than that. Let's think about a student who's taking a test. And remember, this isn't a teaching situation. You've assigned the test, that you've handed it out, the kids are to fill it out. They can ask you some questions perhaps, but if they say, what is that word or what does that mean, you can't answer it. And so the student is on his or her own. There are only two sources that the child has to figure out those words. One is morphology. That is the meaningful parts of the words, the prefixes and suffixes and combining forms, the roots. And the context, the words around it. And I'm noticing from my visits to schools that I don't think our students are especially proficient at either of those. They might be learning an increasing number of words, and that's good, but they're not necessarily learning the word parts or learning to use context as effectively as I'd like to see. Even in schools where we teach those things explicitly, a lot of times we undermine their use. For example, are we doing too much pre-teaching of vocabulary? I mean, we know and I just told you, if you teach the kids some of the words from a particular text, their comprehension of that text usually goes up. So that seems like a smart thing to do, and yet I think there's some circumstances where we shouldn't be doing that. When I look at lessons that various publishers put out, if I look at lessons that a lot of teachers put online and so on, I'm seeing that teachers and publishers aren't always sensitive to the fact that we should be more selective in the words that we pre-teach. And I have a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. This first one, I think this is a 4th grade example. And it's just something, I pulled from an existing lesson to make my point. This is a typical elementary science passage. It just like science passages in textbooks and lesson plans around the country, science lessons teach a lot of terminology. They teach a lot of scientific concepts and the words that describe those concepts. In this case, the passage is focused on photosynthesis. And in fact, what the passage does is it explains and defines the concept of photosynthesis. I don't have any problem with that. You know, you can like or dislike this passage, but it's perfectly reasonable what they're doing. Why would the person who made up the lesson that goes with this have the teacher pre-teach photosynthesis? See, I would argue that if the author, as in this case, if the author is going to explicitly define and explain a concept or a term, that's a term that should not be pre-taught. That's a term that should be questioned after the reading. It's a comprehension matter, not a vocabulary matter. You can pre-teach any of the other words on this slide, and I'd support you, but pre-teaching the one that the author is going to explicitly define is a big mistake, and we ought not to be doing that. A second example, and again, it's just an elementary science passage. I've highlighted a few words. These are words that I have selected myself. And my question to you would be, do you believe that students in your classroom would be able to figure out the meanings from context of any of these words? Some scientists argue that these gases have heated up our atmosphere. They say global warming will affect our climate so dramatically that glaciers will melt, sea levels will rise. In addition, it's not just our atmosphere that can be polluted. Oil from spills often seeps into the ocean. Now, any of those words could be selected for pre-teaching. None of them are explicitly taught. But if you think that your students would be able to figure any of those words out from context, I was just talking to a teacher a couple days ago. She said she thought her kids would get glaciers. Well, if they did glaciers, then I would not want you pre-teaching it. If you're using a textbook that is, in this context is asking you to pre-teach glaciers, I'd ask you not to pre-teach it. To let the kids try to figure it out from context, just like they'd be expected to do on a test. Of course, one of my first questions when they're done reading this would be, what's a glacier? To see if they figured it out. And if they didn't, I'd take them right back into the text and I'd guide them through the process of figuring out what that word meant. We'd work together on it, in other words. You won't always get this right, but in fact, because you'd follow up with it, it really doesn't matter if it turns out that you guessed wrong and the students couldn't figure out a particular word. Clearly, what I'm saying about context is also true about morphology, that we want kids to learn, as I say, those important prefixes and suffixes. What I've included, and I don't really want to say a whole lot about these, but these prefixes that I'm showing you on these two slides have been found to make up about 90% of the words that kids are likely to see during the elementary years, and you know, of all the prefixes that they're going to see. And so making sure kids know these should give them, and that they use them, should give them a leg up when it comes to trying to read a text for understanding, where no one's going to pre-teach the words for you. And this is a similar list on the suffixes. That, you know, it's a fairly small number of suffixes that are used over and over and over again that if kids don't know the meanings of, they're going to have some real limitations. And so I would really suggest that we make sure that we do maybe a better job than we have on those in the past. So I'm really saying let's not pre-teach words that are explicitly defined. Don't pre-teach words that can be figured out from either context or morphology. But definitely, but with both of those, follow up with questions about the words. And if they don't, if they couldn't figure out the word meanings, then you ought to be guiding their interpretation, which would mean either breaking down the words into those parts to see if they could use what they know to figure them out, or by using the other words in the sentences to see what they can figure out. But remember, the purpose here is to make good kids into good readers, which means independent readers, kids who can figure out the meanings of the words in the text, even when the author doesn't tell you, or even when the teacher doesn't jump the gun and get ahead of the text and tell you those word meanings. Let's go right into sentence structure. Unlike vocabulary, which is taught in most classrooms, I don't think we do enough with sentence structure to help kids. Text may be hard because of the grammar or the syntax. Whether you look at that ACT study that I was talking about earlier, where one of the ways that they sorted the text into those categories was on the basis of the sentence complexity, or if you look at Lexile and ATOS and SourceRater and all these different methods that are used for calculating the text readability, they all focus very heavily on the sentence complexity, on the grammar or syntax. What is a student supposed to do in your classroom when they come to a sentence that they just can't figure out, that's just too complicated, has a construction that they don't understand? And sadly, in most classes, this is either a hit or miss proposition for the kids. They either figure out what the sentence means just on the basis of what of the text itself, that they can read that sentence easily, or they don't figure it out. There's no in between. There's nothing you know, unlike with vocabulary, gee, I don't know what this word means. Maybe I can figure it out if I think about it in the context of the other words. Kids don't seem to have the same tools when it comes to the sentences. And so I've got this example from, in fact, from one of our 5th grade books at McGraw-Hill. However, on August 24th, 2006, the International Astronomical Union, IAU, a group of individual astronomers and astronomical societies from around the world made an announcement. My hunch is that that sentence, because of its length, because of all of the different commas and embedding that's going on there, because of the numbers and the letters and so on that are there, these the parentheses and so on, these kids are often not going to get the meaning of this sentence. Unlike vocabulary, I wouldn't argue for pre-teaching a sentence like that, however. What I would suggest is that what we should be doing with students with sentences like that is making sure that we have a follow-up question to the kids to get at whether they understood it. And if they didn't, we ought to be going back with the students to break down that sentence and figure it out. On this sentence, I might just have a question at the end of this page or the end of this section, or if you have the kids read the whole selection at the end of the entire selection. What did the IAU do? If they can answer it, they clearly figured that sentence out. If they can't answer it, it'd be worth going back to. And going back to it might mean doing something like this, might mean breaking the sentence down into its parts. See, one of the things, I want to go back for a moment, one of the things that makes this sentence hard is that the verb made is very deep in the sentence. In fact, this is a 26-word sentence. It's the 24th word. When we talk to each other or when we have more colloquial kinds of text, made will often be, the verb would be the second or third word. It would come fairly early in the text so that the student could actually start to use that word to figure out the rest of the sentence. But as you can see in this diagram of the sentence, made comes very, very late. And the reason is, like in a lot of science text, the subject is huge. The International Astronomical Union, IAU, a group of individual astronomers and astronomical societies from around the world. Kids can't find the verb, and so they can't make sense of the sentence. And so what I would probably do with this sentence, maybe my first question to the kids, if I was trying to teach it, would be, can you find a verb in there? And what is the verb? And now that we know that something was made, who made it? And then we tried to find the words that talked about the subject, and we start figuring it out. We've worked through it. Or I could do it with some kind of intensive questioning. Who was that sentence about? Who were they? What did they do? What did they make? When did they make it? Actually making the kids think through each part of the sentence so that they could get used to doing that. Let me just do one more example of this. The women of Montgomery, both young and older, would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments, or their Sunday suits and blouses that needed just a touch, a flower, or some velvet trimming, or something to make the ladies look festive. 44 words, 2 commas, and an em dash. My hunch is that's going to be a sentence that a lot of fourth graders aren't going to understand. And so if the teacher recognizes that a sentence like that could be a big challenge, she can prepare for it. She can be ready so that when the kids are done reading this story, she can ask them, what did the women of Montgomery do? And there are lots of ways of breaking this sentence down, taking away some of the extra ideas like I did just there to make it more focused, or splitting the sentence up at the ands, or in this case the ors, to try to focus on the parts, or on showing kids the parallel structure here, how that dependent clause works. Gee, the women of Montgomery would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments, or the women of Montgomery would come in with their Sunday suits and blouses that needed just a touch. Kids, don't necessarily know what to do with that dependent clause, this part, their Sunday suits and blouses, and so I'm going to show them stuff like that. And we can do those all day long. essentially what I'm saying is identifying complex sentences in the text that students read, aim questions at assessing the comprehension of those sentences, not sentence by sentence, but you'd ask these again at the end of the section or the page, wherever you'd normally ask your questions. And the sentences to focus on, particularly long sentences, sentences with a lot of internal punctuation, dependent clauses, parentheticals, anything that might throw the kids, confuse them, and then guide the students to actually make sense of those questions so that they're not all on their own. The idea of it, of course, isn't just that they'll comprehend that text, but that as they read other texts, they'll understand those better as well. And in fact, when they're in a testing situation and they come to a sentence that they can't make sense of, they'll actually have some tools for taking that on. Let me show you one more language trick that I'd like kids to have when they're taking a test, and that has to do with cohesion. Text can be hard because the relationships and connections among the ideas and sentences may be unclear to readers. This example, the killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments its prey before it eats it, and the killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments the penguin before eating it. Studies show that kids will have more trouble connecting prey with penguin than penguin with penguin. The reason for this is that in our language, the way we connect the ideas is through repetition, like penguin and penguin in that second question, the second sentence, like prey and connecting synonyms, like prey and penguin in the first sentence. We use pronouns, so it might say, torments it before it eats it, talking about the penguin. And some of those are easier and some of those are harder connections to make. I think a lot of our kids get lost in those connections. And again, I've brought an example. This one is 5th grade. Meanwhile, the nebula continued to orbit the new sun until it formed a large flat ring around it. Scientists call this ring a protoplanetary disk. The disk or ring was hottest where it was closest to the sun. And as you can see, the word "it" is coming up with some frequency here. In fact, I think it comes up 5 times across this passage. The first time, it refers to the nebula. The second time, it refers to the sun. The third time, it refers to the disk or the ring. And the fourth time, it refers to the sun's gravity. And each time, kids have to make the appropriate connection. And so, again, what I would suggest that we do as we work through a text like this is we ask kids to do things like go in and find the first scientific concepts here, the nebula, and let's underline that. But now let's find any of the other words that refer to the nebula. And so you can see I've done it by color here, so the nebula and it. And then we'll take that second concept, the sun, and we'll connect it up with any of the words that either repeat it or give a synonym for it or give a pronoun for it, and so on through the passage. Identify those repetitions and synonyms and pronouns and help kids to make those connections. And you can do the same thing with conjunctions. So some kids who come from different languages may have difficulty with particular types of constructions like abstract pronouns, one and any, or with gender markers because they don't have those in their own language. And so teaching kids how to make those kinds of interpretations, again, gee, I'm not understanding this, but there's a tool I have. I can start to connect these words and it'll help me to understand the meaning. Last point I want to make, and then we'll open this up for any questions that we have time for, is we need to build silent reading stamina as well. Many of our kids are good at reading in what I would call conversational reading activities, like guided reading, where we ask kids to read as part of the selection, and we ask them questions, and then we prepare them to read the next part, and we ask them questions again. That works really well for a lot of kids. But on a test, and when you're reading on your own, reading is more of a monologue. The question is, can kids sustain this conversation themselves? Can they use the text as a conversational partner rather than the teacher or the other kids? And the way I think to get at that is actually to ask students to read fairly short portions of text initially, interspersed with teacher questions and teacher support, but that where we spread that out over time, asking kids to read markedly longer text as they go with less and less support. And I'm afraid that in a lot of classes that developmental continuum doesn't change very much in the course of the year. The teacher is always asking kids to read short selections and then following those up with questions, rather than actually stretching kids out reading both harder text but also longer text as they go, building their stamina. Let's have kids read shorter text, followed up with questions, and then when they can do that well, let's stretch them out. And I think if you do this whole list of things, that is making sure that kids can decode and read fluently aloud, teaching them to interpret vocabulary on the basis of context and morphology, teaching students to break down sentences to make sense of those sentences, teaching kids to make cohesive links across text, and certainly engaging students in increasingly long stints of accountable silent reading. I think you're going to find higher test scores, not the fake kinds of improvements that we might see when we focus on bubble kids, and not the sort of Hail Mary pass that teaching kids comprehension skills, that is teaching them to try to answer certain kinds of questions, maybe makes us think it's doing. I think you'll see actual higher achievement. Kids who can read better, but who also get higher reading scores. That's a lot of stuff. What questions do we have? I'll try to give short answers.
Let's see, we have a few good questions here. This comes from Mormia. We've been practicing oral reading and monitor our students' words per minute. Is this effective, or rather than monitoring their reading through sentences to paragraphs?
It is certainly useful to have kids practicing their oral reading on a regular basis, and yeah, it's fine to have even the kids charting their own progress in terms of words correct per minute and so on. I would put my biggest emphasis though on the practice itself and less on the measuring. I think we can measure the performance too often, and so I would maybe do a little less of that, but certainly the oral reading practice is a good one and will help a lot of kids.
Okay, great, thank you. We have another question here from Paige. When I introduce my vocabulary for the week, would it be an effective strategy to introduce the words in context? For example, reading our mentor text, stopping at the unknown words and using context clues or word parts to figure out the meaning, then having the students put the meaning in their own words.
Well, I would, first of all, I'd take a real hard look at your lists of words that you pre-teach and make sure that those are words that either aren't explicitly taught, aren't explicitly defined by the author, or that you don't think that kids could just figure out on their own. That would be the first thing. Certainly, teaching those words in context is fine, but I would suggest that pre-teaching be very quick and very focused. Just, you don't have to have kids trying to guess the words and things like that. Just literally, boys and girls, a glacier is simply a large piece of ice. It's moving ice that moves across the earth. That's it. Let's move on. And then you can follow up when kids actually do the reading. So nothing wrong with introducing it with some context, but the key is not spending too much time on that pre-teaching.
Okay, great, thank you. Looks like we are reaching that 5 o'clock time. Thank you for attending today's webinar. Dr. Shanahan, did you have anything else to add before we kind of close out?
I do. I think we probably have a few more questions than what I was able to answer here, and so I'm going to ask Terry to send those to me. I'll do some written responses, and I think McGraw-Hill was able to blast that out to all the participants, so you will get your questions answered as well as I can. Thank you very much, folks, for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Shanahan. To everyone else, yes, Dr. Shanahan is correct. We will be sending a follow-up email with a link to the recording and answers to any questions that we did not get to today. And of course, if you have any additional questions, you can email webinars@mheducation.com. Also, as you exit the webinar, a survey will be opening, and we would appreciate your feedback to help us improve and plan for future webinars. Thank you again. Everyone have a great day.